Good afternoon and welcome to this week's 2-Minute Warning feature interview, where we look at shedding some light on the most pressing issues of the energy transition. Our guest speaker for this week is Bill Spindle. He's the energy and climate editor at SEMAFOR and former correspondent for Middle East and South Asia, covering the news, the energy markets on those geographies for many years. I'd like to welcome you, Bill, to this week's interview. And I'd like to kick off asking you just mentioned before, right before the recording, you were attending the UN Climate Week. Is there any major particular development you'd like to point out, something interesting happening in that spectrum?
Yeah, thanks, Ignacio. It's great to be here. It's Climate Week here in New York City, along with the UN General Assembly meeting. I think if there's a change this year, it's that even more, the two things have become interwoven. You can really look at the General Assembly meetings and discussions, and they're really, predominantly about energy and climate in many cases. And then you've got the formal focus on climate in the Climate Week itself. So there's a lot of attention to it. I think there's a real sense that in a way the energy transition battle has been joined, both on the climate front, where we've seen just tremendous disruption over the summer in every place from Pakistan to the American West, and in the energy space as well. So everyone's really focused on it now.
Certainly. And I'd like to touch specifically on the point about energy transition, because we're seeing now there's this sort of debate of finding a balance between the energy security and the energy transition, given the current geopolitical context in Europe, right? You're seeing this sort of debate that seems to find a balance between the short-term energy needs against the longer-term energy transition to meet the sustainability net zero goals. I'd like to ask you to kick off this interview. How do you see the situation? How do you see this is affecting the current energy context?
Yeah, I think there's two things going on, right? There's a lot of just news developments in the real world, Russia's invasion of Ukraine primarily, but others that have really made clear that that things are moving. The disruption has really arrived in the energy sector and in the climate sector as well. And I think but I think beneath those kind of news events and disruptions that have happened there, really the bigger, broader thing that's happened is that the energy transition, as we were just talking about, is really gained traction and is in a way that battle has been joined as well. And inevitably that means that fossil fuel, we're going to be walking a tightrope for the next 20, 30 years. Inevitably, energy transition means that fossil fuels are going to be, phased out. And that means walking this tightrope. And that's a very difficult thing. It's good news in the sense that this is happening. It's exciting. It's amazing. We have the tools in many ways to get a lot of this done immediately. And longer term, I think we're going to have other tools, but inevitably it's going to be walking this tightrope of, we don't have the luxury of building the whole new system and then one day flipping a switch and moving over to it. We got to build it while we're moving forward. And that's going to mean some really difficult, complicated, and controversial, and sometimes disruptive and painful trade-offs. And you're seeing that in places, like California recently, which got through its big power crunch in significant part because renewables had been built into the system. They were absolutely critical to avoiding, power shutdowns at the peaks. But at the same time, you're seeing California backtracking on keeping its Diablo Canyon nuclear plant going, which environmentalists had not wanted to do at all, but are now doing. You're seeing in Europe an increase in coal, which surely the Green Party is swallowing hard to deal with. But at the same time, it is going to be a tightrope, and there's going to be times when we need to either slow down or perhaps even increase in the short term fossil fuel use. But the key is going to be whether we build in new infrastructure, whether we build in new capacity that really ultimately ends up being wasted down the road. So it's really, can you keep those two things in mind? And that's a complicated thing. Can we keep those two things in mind, moving forward with a transition, and yet at the same time continuing to provide the energy that existing energy users need, and adding energy for a huge part of the developing world that still doesn't have sufficient power and energy.
Certainly. And just before jumping into our questions more related to the developing emerging economies, I'd like to ask this situation we're seeing currently in Europe, where we're seeing, like, for many years, the Northern European countries have been quite reliant on Russian gas supply. Can this situation, when this is eventually ended, hopefully sooner than later, could this improve the sense of awareness in Europe, the need to be more reliant on clean energy sources and less reliant on hydrocarbons from third-party external countries?
Yeah, I think there's no question that everyone in Europe has gotten the message, and beyond Europe has gotten the message broadly, that fossil fuels are volatile commodities that can cause a lot of difficulties, and that they're in some sense the source of the problem. Now, that doesn't mean you can just phase them out instantly. That doesn't mean that renewable energy is instantaneously going to solve all the problems. Indeed, you're seeing even staunch environmentalists, staunch climate activists coming around to the idea that maybe in the short term, even some coal is going to be needed to keep the power flowing. But I still feel it's the question, ultimately we know where this is headed long term. The question is how fast it gets there and what's the balance along the way. And I do think there are some issues there. I think there's a lot of debate about to what extent, for example, around the LNG market, to what extent do tens of billions of dollars need to be spent on new LNG liquefaction facilities and offtake facilities that ultimately may not be needed or wanted in just a few years. So where will that balance fall? That's hard to say. And, again, it's this balancing act. How fast can you push
Certainly
transition forward without causing power outages, without denying people the energy that they need to keep their economies moving and growing?
Certainly. And we've seen recently also in the US that they've recently passed the Inflation Act law, the Inflation Act. How you think that's gonna influence in terms of pushing the accelerator towards the energy transition?
Well, it's certainly the biggest development and most important development of the last couple of years by far. I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act, which has little to do with inflation, but does have a lot to do with energy transition. We'll have to see how quickly
this will be called the Green Act or Energy Transition Act.
So. Well, it really does include quite a few provisions that help fossil fuel producers sort of add to production there. So, but I do think it changes the mix. It is a huge step that the world's largest economy is now really going to hit, as you say, hit the accelerator, and we'll see how fast it goes and how fast it can move forward. But that's really, I think in some ways this is the sign that the acceleration of the energy transition is really upon us. And again, that raises all sorts of new challenges and difficulties and problems and challenges and disruptions. But I think we've seen from some of the climate impacts over the summer, again, from Pakistan to California to China, that disruption really isn't something we're going to be able to avoid. Delaying and going much slower is not going to decrease the amount of disruption. It may well increase it, over the 10, 12 year span dramatically if we don't move forward. So, avoiding disruption really isn't really an option. It's how we choose which disruption we're going to deal with. And in fact, dealing with both the disruption of climate change and the disruption of the energy transition at the same time is going to be, the challenge of our time, but one that, I think the exciting thing is it's really is starting to move forward, is gaining traction. Again, that doesn't mean we're on a straight line to the disappearance of fossil fuels by any stretch of the imagination. There's going to be a lot of roles that fossil fuels are going to have to play. They're going to be around for a long time, but the direction and the speed of that transition, I think, is really changing dramatically at this point.
Certainly. And let's take a look at Egypt. We have COP27 right around the corner and starting in November. So we've seen like the main message, the main focus of the event is going to be centered around developing emerging economies and coming up with a fair, just transition for developing countries, especially when in the sense that the energy transition doesn't affect the economic opportunities and inclusivity of the populations, right? So wanted to ask, is the current economic energy context, will that affect that message, that those expectations around the summit?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a very difficult conference, and in some ways, I think the dynamic that's defined kind of climate diplomacy, as it were, since the Paris Agreement is really kind of reaching a crossroads, and we'll see whether we can get through what's going to be a very, very tense and really, frankly, acrimonious meeting between developing countries who are increasingly facing really substantial, difficult climate impacts. They don't have the resources to address them, and at the same time, they need energy as well. I mean, Africa, hundreds and hundreds of millions of people that have no energy whatsoever. They want to, use their fossil fuel resources, their traditional energy resources, to meet some of those needs, as well as to feed the global demand for these things. And yet they're being pressured or being told that they need to accelerate their energy transitions as well, and they want money to do that, and indeed the developed world has promised to give them money to do that. Really hasn't come through. There's this $100 billion promise, $100 billion a year that was made more than a decade ago by developed countries to help with both the energy transition and now increasingly to deal with the impacts of climate change in these countries. That $100 billion was supposed to be delivered by 2020 each year. It still hasn't happened, probably won't even happen this year. But in a sense, that has just become, that's moved from being the ceiling of kind of discussion to the floor of discussion. And now really that's just the beginning of what, are clearly going to be, tens of trillions of dollars that are going to need to be spent over the next 10, 12 years in next 20, 30 years, really, in this enterprise of transitioning the energy system and adapting to climate. I mean, these are really, all one has to do is look at Pakistan, 1/3 of it underwater, hundreds of millions of dollars in damage, very little capacity to deal with them on their own.
Yeah, certainly. Just to add to that comment you made about the increasing in the energy demand that is expected from emerging countries, we have organizations such as the International Atomic Energy Agency who are projecting that demand will grow by 2/3 by 2050 only in the emerging economies. That's like twice the current demand of the yes. OECD area.
Yeah.
So it's a challenge in itself. And I wanted to ask, based on out of your experience covering markets in South Asia, in the Middle East, what are the main points that should be touched when looking at this balance between energy transition and ensuring a just, fair transition for these economies and meeting the sustainability energy transition goals?
Yeah, I think the way to think about that challenge is that there really is a kind of division of responsibility or labor here, in the sense that the big emitting countries, China, the US, the EU, they're really need to begin to right this minute begin reducing greenhouse gas emissions. There's some low-hanging fruit in things like methane that can really happen really quite quickly and have an immediate impact. But even carbon dioxide has to begin falling really right now and increasingly rapidly in those developed countries, because that's where the emissions are coming from. I mean, there's just, when you add China, the US, and to some extent India, which is a middle ground player, but you add the emissions of those three together, and you've got the vast bulk of current emissions. But down the road, ambitious countries like India, that has an expanding economy, and Africa, where, as I said, there's hundreds of millions that have no energy at all. And it is the youngest and the largest, youth population on the planet. They need opportunity, and they need energy to achieve those opportunities. So the responsibility of the developing world more is not so much right this very second. And over the next 4 or 5 years, their responsibility really is starting to put in place a foundation of green energy, a foundation of renewables, a foundation that doesn't, that really from the foundation level is built up without the use of fossil fuels. And if they can do that, then when they have their energy takeoff, after 2030, they'll be able to do that without significantly, vastly upping their carbon emissions. So that's really the challenge. India is somewhere in the middle there, really a significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions at the moment, but will be a vastly bigger contributor if it doesn't, make the energy transition here in the next 4 or 5 years in a significant start on that. And then, Africa similarly is going to take off. That those economies are going to grow, and they need to do it in a way that's involves emitting a far fewer greenhouse gases, and that's their responsibility. Is really the longer term. It's building the foundations now so that the longer term expansion doesn't undo any progress that's made by the developed countries now, which they really need to get going on right this very minute.
So certainly we can expect India to take a more leading role in during the summit.
Yeah, I think India is going to, emerge as a sort of a leader of the developing world, and its message of we didn't cause this problem. And even with India, that's largely the case. They may be a fairly substantial quite a substantial emitter today, but historically they're very small emitter, and on a per capita basis, they're really quite a small emitter. So I think they'll really stand up for the developing world. And at the end of the day, I think it's, where will decisions get made? How practical are things going to end up? And I think that largely depends on something that's already happened to a certain extent, which is some of the big emitters stepping up and showing that they're going to actually reduce emissions themselves. The US IRA Act is a significant step in that direction. But also what they haven't done is really show that they're going to be willing to pour trillions of dollars in both aid and adjustment funds to deal with climate change itself. But then, hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars, tens of trillions of dollars, really, ultimately in the energy transition in these places as well, not just spending it on themselves, but spending it in places like India and Africa to move along them and help them build those, green foundations they need to expand energy over time. If those things happen, possibly we get some sort of an agreement and a happy ending to this COP. I'm fairly skeptical that we're going to kind of get there this time. And, we may have to go through a period where international climate diplomacy really isn't to the extent that it has been. And that's not all that much. I'm pretty skeptical of the impact that global climate diplomacy has had on the whole situation. But we may go through another period where it's really a non-factor, and we're back to depending on the efforts of individual countries and individual players and actors from business to environments to everyone within those countries to move this thing along. That will be a harder situation. It would be a lot better with a kind of cooperative global geopolitics that worked with this, but we may have to do it without it.
Yeah. For example, like we saw in previous COPs, like the Paris Agreement, the outcome. Many voices were quite optimistic about the result and the commitments from countries to set their own goals, right? So, and now we have voices like suggesting coming up with some sort of new Green Deal or Green Marshall Plan to help different countries reach those energy transition targets. How do you see that? You think that
I
that's
think that's,
doable? Or?
that's going to be sure. That's going to be the topic of discussion. Is that needed? Sure, that would be. It certainly is needed. It certainly would be fantastic. Whether that's going to happen at a time when most of the major economies are really, really focused on their own domestic situation, whether that's President Xi trying to get his third term in China, the U.S. With its own political machinations in the midterm elections, looking forward to the presidential elections in 2 years, or Europe dealing with this invasion of Ukraine and the really difficult energy crisis that it's caused. Whether you're going to see a major effort by the developed countries to offer up and put together the type of program that is going to make the developing world happy, I'm skeptical that's really going to happen. And that may lead, as I say, to some sort of a kind of a train wreck on the international diplomacy front, which is certainly not good news. But we also shouldn't forget that international climate diplomacy has not been what has driven most of what's happening. That's been basically market forces. It's not been insignificant. Paris wasn't insignificant, but basically what's driven the energy transition to the point where now it's gaining traction is the fact that there are alternatives that are now proving economically competitive, well, more than competitive in many cases. They're not instantly the solution right now. They can't solve everything. Battery storage is really the next big front, or at least storage in general. But you've seen, incredible drops in the price of renewable energy, particularly solar, certainly wind, lots and lots of room to run with both of those.
Yeah.
And
because
certainly is really the next.
When it comes to
and that's
renewable,
what's pushing.
Yeah. Because when it comes to renewable energy technology and renewable energy technologies in general, we seem to be getting into a conversation between what is available right now, what is the low-hanging fruit that can help us meet our short-term energy security needs, versus what is experimental, sort of the green hydrogen electrolyzers, improved solar capacity storage. To what extent would you say this is something plausible? Like renewable energies are something plausible to meet these short-term energy security needs?
It's not going to meet all those needs, that's for sure. That's why you see countries like Germany, looking for some increases in coal. That's why you see China increasing some of its coal production, and why you see California backtracking on things like nuclear and beginning to rethink the role that I feel like that could play. So it's not going to solve the problem immediately, for sure. But compared to 10 years ago, the solutions are really far, far more at hand, and they don't really involve necessarily, in many cases, trade-offs immediately between, spending more to get renewables. They're actually cheaper. That doesn't mean that they're instantaneously applicable. I think a country like India has seen amazing increases in solar and wind, for example. Are they to the point where they can just begin driving coal out of the system? No, they certainly don't feel they are. But they're making huge investments now in things like battery production within the country, and storage and hydrogen. That there's a huge hydrogen push going on in India. So, those solutions are going to, we're going to figure out how to implement those sorts of solutions over the next few years. In the interim, we walk that tightrope where we're going to need to balance the need to continue delivering power and energy in the moment, and expand the number of people in the world who have access to energy. That's a difficult task we've taken
Certainly.
upon ourselves, but that's really what's going to happen. It's in a way, it's what you've named your show, right? 2-minute warning. We've really let it get down to the last 2 minutes. We're kind of behind in the game. So we're going to have to keep pushing. We got to keep pushing the envelope because we need to score goals, quite a few goals in the next few years. But at the same time, we can't give up goals either. We've got to really play some defense as well at the same time, and that's that tightrope we're going to have to walk.
I just remember another event we organized. One of the speakers said about the energy industry that they must continue delivering on the quarter without losing sight of the decade. And I think that describes pretty well the situation we're living right now. Let's look at the other side of the
big.
Yeah, true. And well, I wanted to say, let's look at the other side of the equation and have a look at oil, petroleum companies, hydrocarbons. We see many of these petroleum companies trying to hide or even remove the word petroleum from their names. They're even launching their own energy transition business units. What is your take on the role these companies should take to push forward, accelerate the energy transition?
Yeah, I think they're gonna, walk that tightrope with us. There's no question that there's going to be continued demand for fossil fuels, oil, gas, hopefully not too much coal. And the companies that know how to deliver that and the countries that know how to deliver that are going to continue to play a role. I think you're going to, you've already seen in places like Europe, where the private, the non-governmental energy players, the big IOCs there have begun to shift their emphasis. They're really not investing in a big way in these long-term, major, very expensive energy projects to try to increase production over time. I think people worry about that. At the same time, I think you're seeing even in places like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, a growing consciousness of the need to at least begin to expand the stable of sort of the base of their economies in anticipation of a decline ultimately in oil demand, which hasn't reached us yet, but which is going to reach us as EVs are really expanding now at a kind of exponential rate, and you're going to see oil demand is going to peak. That doesn't mean that the UAE, that Saudi Arabia, that other oil producers can't play a role. But as they talk about, I think you're going to see a restructuring of that industry around the lowest cost, lowest emitting producers. That puts again the UAE and Saudi in a pretty good place over time. That if the world needs oil and has to have some of it, then they're the logical ones to keep supplying it. That'll of course have lots of geopolitical implications for OPEC and for these countries themselves. But and I do think that ultimately they're going to have trouble if they try to hold back the transition, to the extent that they work with this difficult balancing act we've got, and are seen as pushing the envelope forward and pushing progress forward, while at the same time helping keep the energy flowing. That could work, but they're going to have to go with the flow here. I personally think.
Certainly. And for my last question, as an energy and climate editor, which one would you choose as the climate energy story of the year?
Well, I think it's both, right? It's climate. It's really that both things that I think the realization that climate change, we've known it's having its impact, but I think we've now this summer and over the last 6 months begun to even more realize the pace at which it's accelerating and the inevitable disruption that it's having and will continue to have. So that on the one hand, combined with the more exciting and interesting and encouraging news that this energy transition is really underway in many ways. Now that's in some ways scary, in some ways very challenging, but in also many ways very exciting. It's gonna it's really introducing a huge new challenge that we've all got to get going on and are getting going on. So I think it's the combination of those two things. It's the traction that the energy transition is really beginning to have in a meaningful, serious way, and the challenges that brings on, and then really the alarming sort of acceleration of climate change, which is really only going to continue. People who don't think that's the case are fooling themselves. Certainly.
Well, maybe something happens by the end of the year, and we'll probably have to call you for another 2-minute warning interview. I'm afraid we'll have to. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk with you, Bill. We'll have to wrap it up here. Bill, this has been the end of this week's 2-minute warning feature interview with Bill Spindle, energy and climate editor at SEMAFOR. Feel free to follow him on social media, and stay tuned with Gulf Intelligence for more related content. Thank you, Bill.